Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 20 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We have over 160 episodes recorded and available on YouTube, so if you've missed out on any episodes, you can always catch up on our YouTube channel. Please remember to like and subscribe so you can receive updates when we post. We are also on all major social media channels, and you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show. Although I should warn people, if you hadn't noticed already, unfortunately our Facebook page has been hacked. So we do still have the Facebook group, but so you can get in touch with us there. Of course, we do aim to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. So if you do enjoy the series and can contribute no matter how small an amount, please do consider donating. You can donate through the BirdLife South Africa webpage at the link on the screen, or you can scan the QR code to take you there directly. Otherwise, you can also EFT BirdLife South Africa directly and use the reference webinars and your name. And we are so grateful to those of you who continue to support us. On to tonight's episode, we are joined by my colleague Lorinda Hart, who is making her debut on Conservation Conversations. So Lorinda grew up in Eswatini, where she developed a passion for nature from a young age. She attended boarding school in Pretoria and then realized that corporate city life was not for her. She enrolled at University of KwaZulu-Natal to study zoology, where she completed her PhD on the relationship between fleshy-fruited invasive plants and their frugivores. She's done quite a lot in between then and now, spending 4 years at the University of Namibia as a senior lecturer and 2 months in Japan as a guest lecturer and researcher. But in October last year, she returned home and took up this new position at BirdLife South Africa as the Birds and Agrochemicals Project Manager, starting up a whole new research program here. And so she will oversee pioneering research on the impact of agrochemicals on South Africa's bird species, which will inform effective and long-term mitigation strategies. And this is such important work and work that hasn't really been focused on before, at least not in BirdLife South Africa, and I don't think any other organization. So we're very happy to have you on the show, and you can start sharing, Lorinda.
Thanks, Christina. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's actually my 1-year anniversary since joining BirdLife, so it's quite a debut. And hopefully I'll get to share what I've learned up till now. Agrochemicals really isn't something I had done before. And okay, so as Christina said, this is a new project in BirdLife South Africa, and it's exactly 1 year old today. So we're really excited to share some interesting things with you. But I'll also just frame agrochemicals in an African context in particular, and hopefully elucidate as to why we've come to do this project and the importance thereof. Okay, so as most of you know, the human population is set to reach about 10 billion by 2050. But what many don't realize is that nearly half of this growth between now and then will come from sub-Saharan African countries. And that's quite alarming if you think of that in terms of resources and demands that will place on our ecosystems. In 2011, Tillman and his colleagues predicted that by 2025, which is next year, we'd have about 1 billion hectares cleared for croplands. But by 2020, we had far exceeded this already, and it had reached 1.6 billion hectares. So you can immediately see that it's not surprising that BirdLife International has recognized agriculture as the greatest threat to our threatened bird species. And of the different kinds of agriculture, croplands is the greatest. I just want to do a slight segue here and obviously highlight that pesticides is just one puzzle piece of agriculture. There's lots of other things such as habitat homogenization, for example, that can reduce biodiversity. And certainly in some cases, it's shown to increase biodiversity on farms by creating novel habitats like adding dams and maintaining corridors and so forth, but at the expense of losing species that are quite specific, for example, grassland species. And so this is very broad brushstrokes, and obviously we're just honing in on the pesticide components of agriculture. So it's not surprising that there's been this call sent out that to have sustainable farming practices, we really need to try and start looking at using ecosystem services that are readily available and trying to disturb these processes that occur naturally as little as possible. And instead of using chemicals, relying on these natural processes. And so I had the privilege of going to the Western Cape and seeing an example of this where the farmer has stopped using herbicides entirely and has allowed the undergrowth in his orchards to grow. And as you can see, it's quite a diverse mixture of forbs and lovely little flowers popping up. And this provides forage for pollinators almost year round. And what he's found is that he's actually got increased pollination within his orchards while cutting his costs on herbicides that he has to use. So this really is a win-win situation and a really great example of how reduced pesticides can actually benefit farming in some instances. If we look at the global trends, it becomes immediately apparent that the Southern Hemisphere is growing in terms of pesticide use and not showing signs of slowing down, as opposed to the Northern Hemisphere, which has more or less stabilized and in the case of Europe is actually slowly decreasing. If we look at the trends in terms of pesticide use per hectare, it becomes a little bit more refined. And what's really alarming is that in the last 30 years, South Africa's use has more than doubled, compared to the global use rate. So we've increased by 170%, which is really quite alarming. If we look at the use, and I just want to highlight this before the next slide, you'll see here Europe is quite dark shades, which means that they're using more chemicals per hectare. But if you superimpose that with the next image, looking at pesticide bans, you will see that Europe again is in the darker shades and leading the way. So what that sort of suggests to me is that although they are using a fair amount per hectare, the things they are using perhaps are not as toxic or as harmful to the environment. If we look at the bans for South Africa in particular, or Africa in general, you will see that we really have quite a far way to go, especially here in the southern area. And what was quite encouraging is that last year the minister released a list of about 28 active ingredients known to have carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reprotoxic effects. And he was set to ban these by the end of last year, but 21 of these have now been appealed, and I think those are still in process. So I'm not sure where the bans are. But should they come into effect, we'd move from about 3% bans to about 7.5% within South Africa. One of the main criticisms with South Africa is that our agrochemical legislation is outdated and fragmented. So if you consider all our legislation that refers to toxic chemicals, there's about 20 different acts, and these are scattered across 7 different departments. So you can only imagine the management aspect of this becomes quite tricky in terms of assigning responsibility. Our main act for agrochemicals was set in 1947, and only very recently, after much public pressure and from activist groups, has undergone a few amendments, which came into effect at the end of last year. One of the most notable ones is that for pesticide registration, they need to attach any known negative effects or any reasons as to why these pesticides are banned elsewhere. They also need to reapply for registration every 3 years now. This was previously not the case. So if something was approved, it remained on the market indefinitely. And so a lot of our earlier pesticides, which were highly toxic but not known at the time, were approved and are still on our markets as a result. Unfortunately, there is a clause that the minister still has the sole discretion to decide to approve something even in the face of these negative impacts if he or she feels at the time that the benefits would outweigh the negative impact. So there is still some wiggle room, but certainly there is definitely more pressure on them, as well as more rights within the consumer to raise any concerns that they have during the registration process. So that is definitely a step forward. Another concern is that our markets do not adequately regulate the maximum residue limits on our produce. So typically what happens is a grower will adhere to his destination markets regulations. So if a farmer is exporting to Europe where certain things are banned, then he needs to adhere to the European standards of pesticide use. But that means that anything that does not meet international standards is redirected to our local markets. And I was in discussions with someone in the Cape, sort of within this sector, and it really is up to the retailers to be testing the foods that they're putting on the shelves. And unfortunately, this is not the case. So that's definitely concerning as well. South Africa is the largest pesticide user in sub-Saharan Africa, and we account for about 2% of global use. In 2018, we were listed as one of the top 5 global exporters of hazardous pesticides, and we're likely still near the top. We have about 40,000 commercial farms, and that accounts for about 40% of our land surface. And in addition to those, we also have 2.5 million subsistence farmers and about 200,000 small-scale commercial farmers. So it really just starts to paint this picture of extensive pesticide use within the country. We also have about 500 active ingredients on our market, which in turn are used to make up approximately 3,000 to 9,000 products. The reason for that discrepancy and wide range is that the information regarding pesticides is not freely available, although it should be. It's considered fairly sensitive by all of those who have asked. But these are values based on other publications, and so it's really difficult to know the exact number, but it's within the few thousand, so that's still quite high. And just in case you're not sure what the difference between an active ingredient and a product is, active ingredients, as the name suggests, is the portion of the product that will carry out a specific action. So it might disrupt photosynthesis or interrupt neural pathways within the brain, for example. And that in turn is used in different concentrations and mixed with other formulants, which might help it to bind to a plant surface, for example, or persist longer within the environment, such as an oil base. And that in turn will make up lots of different products. So if I had to use perhaps a more familiar example, paracetamol is your active ingredient, and Panado, Calpol, Grandpa would be your products. And so you can see why you would always have fewer active ingredients and more products. So part of my mission tonight is to also provide you guys with some tools and empower you so that I can send you out to be my pesticide soldiers. And that is to be able to recognize legal pesticides and to report those which are not legal. And to do that, you really need to have an understanding of what should be on a pesticide label. The date giveaway is to look here for the registration number. If you recall, we have our main act from 1947, and each product will have a registration number here. The X's will be replaced by numbers. In addition to that, there are many other regulations the label should adhere to, such as having pictograms. These pictograms should follow the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. And this is just so that wherever you are in the world, whoever adheres to the system, you'll be able to interpret these pictograms if you're not able to read the text on the label itself. There also should be a minimum of 2 precautionary statements, for example, the manufacturer information, and a whole host of other things that you can see highlighted over here. In addition to this label, there will be instructions on concentrations and various mixing and application procedures for different crops, which the pesticide can be used in or on. And in addition to that, you will have a safety data sheet, which really resembles that leaflet that you find in your medication box, only far more extensive, going into details on the chemical components, flammability, treatments for various exposures and so on. So it's really extensive information that should be available to the user. What's important to remember is that the label is law. And so if someone is caught perhaps not following the mixing instructions or not using the recommended safety precautions, there can be repercussions to that. As you will recall, the pictograms on these labels follow the GHS system, which is a global system. And unfortunately, it wasn't trialed before it was rolled out. And what has since been found, specifically to South Africa, but without a doubt across other countries, is that the interpretation of the images used has not been very successful. And that's largely because people will interpret images based on their cultural backgrounds or terms of reference within their environment that they're exposed to. And so here we can see this example over here of a fish with some water and a line through it. And the correct interpretation is that this is dangerous to fish and water bodies. If we come across here to look at some of the farm workers' interpretations, we'll see that it ranged from a fish badge for Saddam Hussein, dangerous when a fish tin is left open, be careful when you put your child in the water, and a few others. So you really can see that the interpretation is definitely not within a pesticide context. And this was a study that was conducted with the Western Cape, and over 50% of farm workers could not identify the correct meaning of these pictures. In a study from Limpopo, it was found that 44% of workers were unaware of the pesticide hazards, and that's nearly 70% did not follow safe handling methods, despite being a requirement. So that definitely is quite concerning. And not surprising then that we see quite high levels of poisoning, and not necessarily lethal poisoning, but just poisoning incidences that are being reported. It's estimated that globally about 44% of agricultural workers are affected by poisoning to some degree. And of course, this is suspected to be higher in low-income countries because reporting rates and accurate record keeping are probably not as good as they are in more developed countries. Really concerning as well is that nearly 30% of the pesticides used in developing countries don't meet international standards. And so it's likely that we will also have higher poisoning levels because we are using so many more toxic or highly toxic products. And so after seeing a few interesting headlines relating to pesticides, I decided to put on my carte blanche hat and headed over to a local shop, and I found these products here, this red packets and this green packets and a few others. There's ones in the background here, and I took these photos of the labels, and immediately you can see this does not meet the regulation because it's not in English, which is the regulation, but also importantly it's lacking our Act number. Okay, so this is one that is allowed. Obviously, this is an insect spray that we have in South Africa and that we commonly use. And these are the illegal products. And so what has been happening, especially in the Eastern Cape, there's been a lot of raids lately where they've been confiscating these illegal pesticides. And so if you do come across them, you really can report them, and we can start reducing the amounts of illegal pesticides on our shelves. Of course, another concern is decanting of pesticides, which is a completely separate challenge. This is typically done in our local spaza shops to make pesticides available to those struggling with cockroaches and rats, especially in the informal settlements, but again, not meeting any form of label. In fact, completely incorrect label, and dangerously so, being a juice bottle. And so knowing how to apply this safely and discard of bottles and things will not be available to the end user. So that definitely is a concern as well. Something else I just want to point out with this label here. So this product was manufactured in China, and it's too small here, but the active ingredient is acephate. Now, acephate is banned in China, but nothing stops them from still manufacturing this active ingredient and then shipping it out to countries where it is still allowed, such as South Africa. And so we're also starting to see more and more a lot of pressure, and even from the UN, to countries which have banned these active substances to not be allowed to continue to manufacture and send them out to countries which are still using them. Something that we often get told is that, well, these have all been tested and so they should be safe to use, and we'll follow the labels and so on. But just want to point out a few things or few processes that take place during a lot of the testing stages of these active ingredients. And that is that they are often limited to a model species. So these will typically be a quail species or a mallard duck, for example, and they are placed in a sterile laboratory where they are force-fed increasing concentrations of an active ingredient or injected with it, depending on the path of entry. And then they work out how many individuals, or at what point 50% of the individuals die. And then that is termed the LD50 or lethal dose 50. And using that information, they then start working out concentrations which are considered safe for use in the field, if they are able to reach a concentration that will still be useful or have an effect within the field. They often don't consider sublethal delayed effects, and also they don't consider the degradation that takes place of these agrochemicals within the environment, often forming new isotopes or new compounds entirely by combining with other chemicals in the field. And often these new products can be more toxic than the initial one that they tested. They also don't consider sequential or simultaneous applications or cocktail effects where they mix with other agrochemicals used at the same time. And so it really is a challenge to try and understand how something that is largely tested in a very sterile, controlled manner can be integrated with a correct knowledge within the ecosystem. Something else to consider is that within an ecosystem, there are lots of different processes taking place, such as various water table processes, evaporation, precipitation. We can have pesticides entering the groundwater, or traveling further afield with the wind, or through dust, or binding to soil and remaining there for quite some time. And what was really alarming is that from a whole range of studies, they've come to understand that only 0.1 to 2% of a pesticide will actually reach its intended target. And so there's many other places that these pesticides can end up. Of course, it will be determined whether or not they are water soluble or how persistent they are. A lot of the agrochemicals do break down fairly easily within the sun. And so again, these are very broad blanket statements, but possibilities that could take place for the very persistent agrochemicals in the environment. So why birds? And it's not just because we are BirdLife. Birds are, as this title suggests, barometers for our planetary health. And we're very fortunate in that we know more or less all the species that exist. It's not very often that we discover a new species. Perhaps it's one that was previously thought extinct, or a species that we know that has been divided into a subspecies. For the most part, we really do know all the birds that exist, unlike insects, for example, which really we still have so many to discover. Another important thing is that birds are very mobile, and so when there is a disturbance to their environment, they can move away quite quickly and so respond perhaps a lot faster than more sedentary species might. And what we know is that often other organism groups will mimic the trends that we see within the birds. So if the birds are declining, it isn't long and we start seeing declines in other things that we start looking at. We also know a lot about their physiology and their behavior, and a lot of them we know about their movement patterns. And so using all of this knowledge, we really are able to understand more clearly the effects that agrochemicals might be having. And they really are an effective model species for us to use. And so I'm going to shamelessly ask everyone to please continue with your birdlasser, because the information that we see in changes of species or abundance within different areas undergoing transformation especially are vitally important to us as scientists to use and to see what effects these chemicals might be having. Other things that we need to remember is that our regulations differ worldwide, and this leaves particularly migratory species at risk. I'm sure many of you have listened to our wonderful vulture presentations and have seen that they don't respect our borders and move quite freely between many of our southern African countries. And so really, we're hoping that this project will soon gain momentum and be able to expand into other critical areas that the birds are being exposed to. Southern Hemisphere species tend to live longer and have smaller clutch sizes. And so this lack of research on our species and the impacts that agrochemicals are having on them is concerning, because if birds which don't live as long are having effects, can you imagine what might be taking place for a species that lives longer in terms of bioaccumulation or biomagnification? Also, if you're having smaller clutch sizes, if there's any reproductive effects, you would anticipate that the effects would be quite negative to these species in particular. Something else that's often reported with agrochemicals is that there's higher toxicity for birds when compared to mammals. And the simple answer is that birds are not mammals. But for those of you who want to know, there's several items here, but I am aware of time, so I won't delve into all of them. But one of the main ones is that birds tend to have a higher food intake rate, and that's because they have a higher body temperature to maintain. So I always used to tell my students it's like keeping a fire warm and having to constantly add wood to the fire to fuel that engine and keep it running at that constant temperature. And so they tend to eat more, which means that they might be taking up a lot more of a chemical with their food. They also have a relatively smaller liver compared to the same body size if it was compared with a mammal. And that is likely due to a flight adaptation so that they are lighter. But essentially what it means is that the organ responsible for detoxifying the bird is smaller and therefore more prone to accumulating toxins within the body. Another detrimental thing is that some pesticides are lipophilic, which means they love fat and essentially bind to either fatty tissue within the bird, or in the case where birds obviously lay eggs, unlike mammals, the eggs have yolks, which are the lovely fatty nutrition for the developing embryo. And so we start having pesticides which are being deposited into eggs and essentially influencing the future offspring in that way. So I won't go through all of them here, but those are just some things to get you thinking about the impacts of agrochemicals. And so the end product here is this very overwhelming image that I developed from a whole host of different sources, just trying to understand any potential direct sublethal effects that agrochemicals might be having on birds. So these are effects that are not necessarily immediately leading to death or killing the bird, but could perhaps in some way after some time either lead to that or influence the population in another way. And if you start looking across the image, you can see that there is almost not one place where you can point to that is not affected. And some of them, unfortunately, are very challenging to measure and understand, such as behavioral changes. And sometimes changes persist even when the chemical has dissipated from the body. And so it's not always very easy to fully understand or attribute these changes to agrochemicals, which becomes quite a challenge when you're trying to advocate for something to not be used anymore. Something that was really interesting that I had not realized prior to taking up this position was that some chemicals can actually have transgenerational transfer, which means that a grandmother who is exposed to a specific chemical which has this property can transfer this not only to her daughter, but to her granddaughter. So a second generation effect, and it starts leading to things like susceptibility to certain diseases, for example, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's being one of them. And this is quite alarming if we start considering the generations that are passing while we are still using chemicals that we know are having these impacts. Of course, there are many reproductive concerns and lots of effects to eggs which can also take place. If we look away from the bird and now at the environment in which the bird finds itself in within the agricultural landscape, you'll notice here, unlike that first image I showed you where the farmer has allowed the undergrowth to grow and has stopped using herbicides, this farmer is using herbicides and is keeping a fairly clear path between the vineyards here. And so in essence, what's happening is that there's a reduction in food source for granivores as well as insectivores, because the weed species and all those forbs that I showed you earlier all provide food for insects or for the birds themselves. And when these become decreased, we start seeing that knock-on effect to the birds within the vineyards. And in fact, when we visited this particular vineyard, despite being in the shadow of this beautiful Helderberg Nature Reserve, it was completely silent. It was actually quite alarming and eerie, and just sort of highlighting the impact that some of these agricultural deserts can have on our bird diversity. Unfortunately, birds tend to synchronize their breeding when there's lots of insects, and that's also when farmers synchronize their insecticide use increases. So this is definitely a challenge in terms of exposure to birds at critical periods. And so understanding things like when is best to apply pesticides and trying to find a balance between the crop growth stage, the pest threat, and the bird's needs is really going to be quite a challenge. And some other things to consider is that the habitat itself is altered, again, reducing cover for predators as well as nest concealment. And in a study in Northern Europe, they actually found that partridges, which nest within agricultural lands, had to forage a lot further, and they had less chicks surviving because of this, because they had to look a lot further to find seeds and grow sufficiently. And so, in summary, when we consider all the different things that should go into making a decision on whether or not a pesticide should be registered within the country, you can see it's not as simple as looking at an LD50 value, or if something immediately dies when exposed to it, for example. But really, we need to look at future generations. We have to look at community levels and impacts as well, and integrate that as well as all the ecosystem processes taking place, such as the pesticide's behavior and its degradation within the environment and so forth, to factor all of that into a comprehensive ecological risk assessment that should be influencing the pesticide regulation decisions at government level. So, what is happening in South Africa? We conducted a literature review shortly after I took up this position, and really just to understand what we have done in South Africa and how much we know about agrochemicals and our birds. And unfortunately, most of the studies simply looked at whether or not the chemicals are present in particular birds or not. None of the other aspects really have been considered. And so we found a total of 43 studies and looking at 75 different species. And of these, only 3 were agricultural in nature, so collecting samples from birds in agricultural settings. And only insecticides were considered in terms of agrochemicals. We included these non-agricultural chemical classes simply because a lot of the literature combined, say, polychlorinated biphenyls with organochlorines, for example. And so just to get an understanding of the exposome and the toxic chemicals present to our birds, we included these in the initial assessment. And you can see here that these PCBs are present or have been second highest in terms of amount of studies done. But these are quite a concerning one because they are considered forever chemicals. And so that means that once they enter the environment, they are essentially there forever. And so the main source of these within our environment came from a lot of our electrical transformers. By the end of last year, Eskom was meant to have eradicated all of the PCBs from them. Whether or not this was met, I'm not sure. I know they had previously asked for an extension. And a study on our black harriers was actually one of the studies here. and they found a correlation between higher levels in birds closer to electrical structures. So that's quite concerning. It's also in our electrical appliances at home. Our brominated flame retardants are often used in industry as well as our electronics, also things such as mattresses and couches, but also present in our birds, often leaching out into the environment. And then finally, our perfluorochemicals or PFCs. I'm sure some of you have read some of the headlines. Your non-stick cookware and some clothing is where you will find those. But for now, I'm going to just hone in on looking at our bird orders. And again, these are not all the orders in the bird book or in South Africa, but just the orders which have been studied in terms of chemicals present in them. And you will see that the organochlorines, not surprisingly, are very well represented, while the other agrochemicals are not very well represented at all. Quite surprisingly, and unlike global trends, we have most of our studies looking at our water birds, and that is largely due to the fact that these studies were often in relation to looking at toxins present in water bodies and looking at uptake in organisms which are using these, and then obviously inferring human risk from that. After the water birds, the birds of prey are very popular in terms of looking at toxicology studies, and that's because they tend to be higher in trophic levels. So that means that they tend to accumulate more toxins by feeding on organisms which have also accumulated those toxins. And so we start having not only biomagnification, but bioaccumulation as well. My apologies, I'm starting to run out of tongue muscles here with all the tongue twisters. Okay, so if we look at just the agrochemicals which have been tested for in our birds, and we now look at those active ingredients that we defined earlier, you will see, again, most of them are the organochlorines, and I've highlighted the ones which have been banned by this red circle above each of them. So it becomes immediately apparent that most of the agrochemicals which we have tested for have since been banned. And so we really don't know what is present or what effect the nearly 500 active ingredients on our markets are having on our birds currently. DDT has the highest number of studies, not surprising because of its continued use for malaria vector control. This has been banned worldwide, I almost want to say in many countries. I think the only ones which still use them are primarily for vector control, not just malaria, but also for tsetse fly. They did try to replace this with a less toxic chemical. Unfortunately, it was more expensive, which led to not using as much, and of course resulted in higher incidences of malaria, which was the motivation to return back to DDT. So this is a very concerning one, highly persistent and known endocrine disrupting effects with really negative impacts can be transferred across the placenta and in breast milk to infants. So definitely a concern for brain development as well. Methoxychlor is another one of concern. So the last sample was taken in 1975. So I've just added these years in here of our last samples collected for the ones we are still using. And at the time, methoxychlor was not present, but since then they've collected various sediments, I think in 2015, in soil and water, and methoxychlor is definitely now present in our environment and warrants further investigation within our birds because studies have found that this is a great endocrine disruptor. It was actually produced to replace DDT to be a less toxic compound, but found later to be also quite a nasty one. It's been banned in the US and in Europe, and also has negative effects on birds, transgenerational effects as well, so being passed on to the offspring. Chlorpyrifos is banned from household use, but is still used within the agricultural sector. This one has mixed reviews, so it has been found that the spray formulation doesn't pose as big a risk to birds. I think just the exposure is limited in terms of what they actually take up. but the granular formulation has been banned in many countries and is highly lethal and obviously easier for birds to ingest a granule, and the effects thereof are quite concerning. Chlorpyrifos has also been detected in ice cores in the Arctic, which date back to the 70s. So at one stage, it was the most widely tested for and found chemical highly present in the environment because of its persistence. Also known endocrine disrupting effects, so also should be a concern for us, if not at least further regulated use in terms of which forms we should be using. And then finally, imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid, and this is a very underrepresented group of active ingredients, which we definitely need to look into within South Africa, because neonics are systemic, which means that farmers will coat seeds in this active ingredient and then plant the seed. When the tree or seed, mealy seed, whatever they are planting grows, that active ingredient becomes incorporated into the cells of the plant. And so when the plant produces a flower and bees feed on the pollen, they are exposed to this insecticide. And so neonics are the ones which have been attributed to the great declines of bees often. And so definitely also linked to insect declines in general, which have been translated and linked to our insectivore birds declining. And so definitely a concern, definitely something we should be looking at. But again, in a lot of places it has been banned, but some do allow some of the neonics, but with very careful regulations, such as planting and ensuring that all seeds are covered so that birds cannot ingest them. I think a study looked at the birds ingesting them. I think a sparrow needs to ingest 3 or 4 seeds for 3 days in a row, and then it will die. And our only study, we've done one study, was in the Western Cape with the Cape spurfowl, and it was only done because they were doing bird counts and noticed the spurfowl sort of flying up into the air and then plummeting down, some of them dying, some of them very disorientated and dying shortly after. And when cutting open the crop, discovering these blue-colored seeds and then testing them and finding that it was imidacloprid covered seeds. So really careful regulation and use, reducing seed spillage would go a long way in mitigating such events from happening. So what are our next steps? We aim to assess the toxicity of our current pesticides and to better understand exactly the toxic risks that they pose. And we'll do that using the European Food Safety Authority's protocol, which I'll explain very briefly in the next slide. But essentially what we want to try and do is work with farmers and be able to recommend less toxic agrochemicals or practices that can really mitigate negative impacts to our birds as a whole. And then, as I mentioned earlier, start working with partner countries to try and do the same and really just increase the impact thereof. So this is a very scary table, which I don't want you to become overwhelmed with, but just a very simplified version, I might add, of a tier 1 risk assessment, which is what we do using that EFSA protocol that I mentioned. And because I'm really at the end of the talk and you've heard my tongue twisting capabilities have run out, we'll just call them active ingredient A and B. If we look here at the different formulations, these indicate the concentration of the active ingredient for every liter of the product, okay? So you can see these are quite different. The formulae also take into account the different crop types, the different growth stages of either the weeds or the crops, depending on what you're looking at. And then it uses a generic focal species, guild, or diet. You can see here insectivores, granivores, frugivores, omnivores. And that is because birds eat different things. And so if you're applying insecticides, it's more likely that an insectivore will be influenced because it will be in the insects which are covered by the pesticide. And so its risk and exposure will be higher as compared perhaps to a granivore. It also takes into account the application, so whether or not you're applying this pesticide once or twice, and whether or not this interval is 2 weeks, 3 days, or 6 weeks. And so all these different things, and I'm not going to go through all of them, I am conscious of time, but just to highlight that really all those things we spoke about in the beginning are incorporated into this equation. And very importantly, we get what we call a trigger value. So here we have one for reproductive effects and one for acute. So in other words, causing death. And what you end up with here is you want to see a value that is over 5. And again, here you can see these values are below 5. And so we end up with a comment refinement needed, which means that we need to further assess this to see if this is in fact something we should be removing from the market, or best case scenario, I guess, is just getting farmers to agree to not use this where we can't get them removed or banned. And also looking then at the acute, you want a trigger value over 10. And then you know that it should not be causing death. So here's a good example where the farmer might be using this active ingredient or product with it and saying, oh, but the birds aren't dying, so it's okay. But in fact, you are having these reproductive impacts or sublethal impacts taking place. And after this initial process of the tier 1 assessment, you can go up to a tier 3 assessment where you start actually fitting transmitters to birds and factoring in things like how much time is spent within the agricultural landscape. When are they in the agricultural landscape? Is it when pesticides are being applied? Looking at diet composition, because moths and earthworms and beetles pose different risks in terms of accumulating different amounts of the pesticides applied. And so you really can refine these numbers right down if needed. But for the most part, these are fairly reliable as indicators of products which are better to use and others which should be avoided. So I'm turning this over now to you as my audience to just think about your chemical footprints at home. What insecticides are you using? You don't have to be a farmer to be using chemicals and placing them out in our environment. Hopefully not using rodent poisons. I'm sure there's been a lot of advocacy around that within the bird networks. But think about things. Have you ever looked at reading your dog or cat's tick and flea collars? Do you know which active ingredients are used in them? They absorb through the skin, which places you at risk as well if you're stroking them. So really just things to start thinking about and how you can reduce your chemical footprint. And I've just provided a few suggestions. Of course, there are many that you can do, but really start a conversation. Start talking to your retailers and asking for information as to where your products were grown and what was used on them. Report those illegal pesticides when you see them. I've told you how to spot them now, so there's no excuse. Support projects or start your own. Work with the school and learn how to grow organic veggies in your garden, and do so in harmony with the caterpillars that can feed the birds in your garden as well. And just finally, a very interesting paper that I found almost at the last minute and thought let me include it just out of interest. Often another argument is that, oh, most of the residues dissipate by the time you get your product. So they all say if we follow the labels, it's fine. But really, there are still residues. And yes, some of them are within legal limits, which are considered not harmful at low doses. But some are not. And even at low doses, I'm sure we would all prefer to reduce our pesticide intake. And so it's been suggested that you can soak your products in a solution of salt, vinegar, or bicarbonate of soda, or even just rinsing underwater for 1 minute is sufficient to remove a lot of the pesticide residues on your food. And very recently, these authors have suggested that we should be peeling our produce. And that's because we've now got this amazing laser technology, which actually penetrates into the fruit and measures the amount. So this active ingredient here is theram, and you can see that it's penetrated down into the pulp using this heat map. And so although it's only 0.3 of a mil, I think with a good peeler, you should be able to remove this pesticide layer here. And so it really is just as we learn more and we know more, we can start implementing changes within our routines just to safeguard ourselves as well. Just for a side note, these authors looked at theorem and combendism. Those are banned in over 30 countries worldwide, but not in South Africa. So unfortunately, your dietitians are all going to hate me for saying it, but perhaps consider peeling your veggies for now, wherever possible. And I hope I've been able to share some insights with you. So, of course, I need to thank our donors who've not only provided the financial means for us to conduct this research, but also have been so generous with their time in guiding us through this process of toxicity assessments and teaching me how to do that has been quite a learning curve. And please drop me an email. I've left my email up there in the corner as well, if there's anything that we don't manage to get to tonight. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much, Lorinda. That was a great presentation, if a little bit scary. Um, yeah, so there are quite a few questions coming in the Q&A box. So yeah, we'll try and get to them, but if we don't get to all of them, apologies, but we'll do our best.
No problem.
So, firstly, a question from Ted saying, am I correct in thinking that if it has the reg number and act number, it does not necessarily mean that they're safe?
Yes, yeah. So that simply means that it's a registered product.
Okay.
It does not mean that it's necessarily safe. So what you can do is you can go online and look for the active ingredient that we discussed, and then you can read up on all the potential harmful impacts of the active ingredient, and that will give you some guidance as to what risk it does pose.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ian Barber, who's our partner from the UK, says, do you think that consumer pressure on retailers in South Africa would have any impact as it has done here in Europe? Is there a role to apply pressure on retailers in Europe and the Northern Hemisphere that import products from South Africa, such as fruit and veg and wine, etc.?
Hi, Ian. Thanks for your question. Wow, sure, consumer pressure. I think to some degree it could be, but it would be quite retail specific. I think, unfortunately, specifically in places such as South Africa, where food security is such a big concern, a lot of people actually are undernourished in our country, alarmingly so. I don't think something like the presence of the agrochemical in your maize is going to worry them. So I'm not sure that we would get the level of consumer backing that Europe might. But certainly some retailers with certain groups which shop from them, maybe higher end markets, would definitely succumb to those pressures more, I would suspect. It's very hard to know, but I have seen a lot of groups and organizations, especially in the Western Cape. There's a group specifically for female farm workers. They've marched to the German embassy and they've really been making their voices heard. And wonder if that's got to do with the new amendments that we've seen in our regulations as well, and the bans that were announced for the CMR ones I mentioned earlier. So certainly there are ways and means of making our voices heard. And I think to sit back and not say anything is not the solution. So the more we say and make it known, the more momentum we will get. Yeah. I don't know if I answered the second half of the question. Was that to do with imports or exports, or?
I think that was to do with countries that import South African produce and whether applying pressure in Europe would cause the suppliers here to change their behavior.
Oh, yeah, maybe. So are you saying that those people importing our produce won't import anymore if all the growers don't follow the same regulations? Is am I understanding? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Um, Yeah, if that's the case, I imagine it would, especially for a lot of our orchards, our vineyards, certainly, yeah. Those that export, I think, would suffer greatly if people stopped using our products. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's also not necessarily a foolproof system because, I mean, Europe imports from all over the world and they're consistently rejecting produce because growers take chances as well. So, as much as they should be adhering, it's not to say that they are adhering. So, yeah, so
Yeah.
they might just say, "Oh, we are," and they're not. So it's very difficult to regulate and manage.
Mm.
But for the most part, commercial growing operations all have a chemical register, which they do need to submit for auditing purposes, to say what chemicals they've used, the amounts thereof, how much they've applied, and so on, and provide information as to why they might have exceeded an average use, perhaps, if maybe they had a particularly bad outbreak. And so it is fairly regulated, but again, the main problem being our regulations are not stringent enough and still allowing those very toxic chemicals to be used. So although they're adhering to the law, I think it needs changing. Yeah.
Mm. Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I'm by no means an expert, but it also seems like there's a push for sort of these perfect fruits and veggies. And if you don't necessarily use chemicals to stop the insects getting at them, you won't have a perfect fruit or vegetable. So
Yeah.
I think that's also one of the arguments that retailers often use um,
Yes.
to justify continuing use.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah. So us as consumers maybe need to lower our standards
yeah,
and
exactly.
just cut out the little black spot or peel
Yeah.
away. We've learned now we can peel our veggies and they all look the same.
Yeah. So kind of picking up on the comment about the sort of regulatory environment and the laws, I'm just looking for the question. Yes, from Steve, is asking, is BirdLife doing anything in Parliament to get our chemical registration legislation up to date? Is that something that you're planning?
Yes, yeah. So definitely that is the end game. We do definitely need to make changes at the high levels. But as you've heard, we 1 year old today and we're still doing the legwork. We've started the toxicity assessments with wine grapes. We're moving on to macadamias. And I think once we've tested enough crops and rolled out sort of, I want to say, focal group studies where we can see the willingness of farmers as well, because at the end of the day, we don't want to dictate to the farmers what to do, but work with them in improving the industry. Um,
Mm.
then at least we can say these are our findings, these are our recommendations, and this is how things can improve. But yeah, it definitely is something we want to do. It's going to be a challenge and probably another year or two before we reach that level.
Mm.
Just because you obviously want to go in with a full understanding of what's going on in terms of impacts and so on. Yeah. So we still need to do some field studies and gather all that information as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and it always seems best to go in trying to collaborate at first before you kind of hit people with the legislation. So try and get
Yeah.
voluntary changes because that always seems to kind of
Yeah.
stick better.
Yeah. I must say, in a lot of, well, obviously I've been to a few different farms, that one in particular in the beginning, they really are trying to be as eco-friendly as possible. So not
Mm.
using herbicides, for example, is quite a big thing
Mm.
to do. And, you know, he mentioned it took a few years for the soils to recover adequately, to have, you know, these plants actually growing, to have enough aeration, to have the worms come back and so on, because essentially the soils become quite sterile after many, many years of pesticide use. And so it's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, we'll just stop this and then we're going to have increased pollination rates and it's great. There's a year or two or three of struggles and really helping things along and patience. And not everyone's in a position to do that either. So every situation is unique. And as I mentioned as well, the pesticides are one puzzle piece. having wildlife corridors, trying to reserve some of your farmland as natural as possible. All these different things can also benefit us. And so it's really a holistic approach ultimately that we'll need to take in combination with the pesticides to better understand what's going on.
Absolutely. So Penny says it's disturbing that neighboring countries like Zim and Moz have banned some chemicals where we have not. Do you know why there's that difference in, between us and our neighbors?
No, that will come down to, their governments. Maybe it's to do with different crops that they grow or international pressures or treaties that they might be following. So we adhere to various international treaties as well. And so DDT, for example, is one which should be banned, but we are still using, and we are allowed to do that because we've actually done an application with the partners of that treaty explaining the need for that because of the malaria, and so they do allow that. But you might find that it's other treaties that they have with other countries or pressure from their citizens, for example, or just different crops that they might be growing that became such a problem that they had to control it more. I really couldn't say, but it is a bit sad. But then again, we ban things that they haven't either. So I think it's really just a mix. Yeah.
Yeah, it goes both ways. Michael, well, kind of linking to what you said on DDT, but maybe you've answered that question, but he's asked, what is the status of DDT use in South Africa? So it sounds like we've applied for a sort of exemption to continue using it.
Yeah. So we still use that. Yeah, we do still use it. And again, concerning because it's sprayed in houses, and you're getting sediments and things which cascade down and into the environment. It's a big concern, that one. But the age-old argument is: do you want people dying from malaria or living with sublethal effects from DDT? So it's a tough one.
That's very tricky. Oh, sorry, I've just lost the question I was going to ask. Mandine asks, how much is being done to educate farm workers on pesticides? And they ask in view of the shocking interpretations that were shared on the symbols and labels on pesticides. Do you know of a work that's being done?
Yeah, so again, a very big, large scale challenge that lies ahead. Certainly, there are some groups, as I mentioned, there's that female farm worker group in the Western Cape. They are very active in working with the ladies on the farms, particularly because women are more at risk to toxic effects from pesticides. And they're doing a lot of work in terms of education as well. Obviously, their workers are very aware of the risks of them. But unfortunately, no. On a large scale, we're not aware. It is something we're looking into. We have a lot of people working with communities, especially in rural areas, where they get handed these label-less pesticides and told to use them on their potatoes, and not knowing the dangers thereof, or how to use them correctly, or how to be safe using them. So it is on the onus of the employer to provide safety for his workers. But again, this is not always done. And sometimes it is done, but farm workers prefer not to work with thick gloves on their hands, or, wear a mask when it's 40 degrees and it's sweltering. So it really is a multifaceted challenge, but definitely something that does need to start by just raising awareness. And hopefully that can start having an impact as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two questions that are kind of asking similar things. Steve Woodhall and Thomas Richard saying, now I'm going to butcher this pronunciation.
At least I won't be alone. Please try.
Neonicotinoids are most pervasive in use as insecticides globally, and there have been many studies on the impact on insect pollinators. And will this not be of concern to insectivorous birds? And Steve
Yeah,
asked
it
a
is.
similar question. Have there been any studies linking the two?
Yes, yeah. So there have definitely been studies. I think perhaps it got lost with all the tongue twisting that I was undergoing. But yes, we've definitely seen trends and declines of our insect, well, not ours, but global trends in different countries that have looked at this, have seen declines in the insects and they've seen declines in the insectivores. So it's also one of the main motivators why it has been banned in a lot of countries. Yeah, but definitely not enough. I think most of Europe has banned, and then 3 or 4 other countries. So yeah, neonics are very popular. They are very good at their job. But yeah, unfortunately posing quite a problem, and especially because they remain and become part of the plant's tissues essentially. So very persistent and toxic. Yeah. So it makes them good at their job, but not good for the environment, I'm afraid.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of linked to that, not really a question, but a comment from Marianne de Villiers from Cape Nature, saying in the context of agrochemicals, insectivorous bats could be considered honorary birds and are also very vulnerable to this threat.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting comment. I was presenting to one of the bird clubs, and a gentleman from, I think, Zim had mentioned on how fruit bats used to be so prolific. And since the coffee plantations and this excessive use of pesticides, they're not so common anymore. So definitely a concern, and definitely really important in terms of ecosystem service providers, because bats disperse very different fruits than birds do. And so, yeah, definitely something we need to consider, especially for our forest regeneration.
Yeah. I think bats often get sort of left out when they are often honorary birds.
Yes.
Glenda asks if there are any studies that have been done to find substances that can be used to replace the dangerous, active ingredients, but have similar effects. Because as you mentioned, it's hard just to go cold turkey and stop using these chemicals. Are there
Yeah.
any sort of viable alternatives?
So that's essentially what we would like to try and do. In my mind, I have a vision of being able to generate a brochure of saying, well, these are all the products registered for wine grapes, for example, and these are the ones in the red zone. So please try and avoid those. And these are the ones in the green zone. So yeah, something that's really easy to interpret and user friendly. But as I can't remember her name, Glenda, was it Glenda?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, that's said having something that has the same effect. So essentially, if you have an active ingredient, for example, that's a herbicide and targets specific weed species, for example, there more than likely is another product with a different active ingredient that does a similar thing. Why some get recommended over others, there could be many reasons. Maybe some are more persistent, or there's a personal preference, or it's generational knowledge that people pass on, or maybe it's just because they're cheaper. So that's also something that we'll be factoring in as well. I think for a lot of farmers, especially, the financial constraints of farming can be challenging. And so, if you recommend a product that costs 5 times the price than the one he's using, I don't know that we'll win convincingly or change minds. So, yeah, they definitely. I mean, there's as I've mentioned, over 500 different active ingredients, and a lot of them do overlap in their function. It's not to say that each one does a different thing. So that's the key, is figuring out which of the active ingredients to use, and not only that, but what concentrations are safe and what application rates are safe. And in some cases, it might be a case where something is not recommended at a specific concentration, but by adjusting that limitation and maybe diluting it a bit more, it could still be as effective, but not as harmful to the environment. So yeah, we don't want to start a big banning war, but we do want to try and improve the farming practices where possible, so that both parties can win ultimately, because a very diverse farm is going to be more productive as well, in my opinion. So
Yeah, absolutely. So Joe asks or says, thank you, you're doing important work and great presentation. And then asks, are you working with entomologists who are also trying to reduce insecticides? because it seems like there's quite a lot of synergies that could come out there.
Yeah, so we're not actively working with them, but yeah, I was recently at a WWF workshop where there were a lot of beekeepers and people from the South African Bee Association, and they definitely have concerns, of course, neonics being one of them, and various other farming practices that are also challenging them and their hives. I was not aware that farmers actually have to hire people with hives to come and pollinate their trees now. I always thought that was an American problem, but yeah, we do it here as well. And so the beekeepers actually work very closely with their farmers, and if they have a very good relationship for the most part, there's a lot of discussion around pesticides that are applied, what they are applying, and when they should apply, and trying to time that with the pollination services that they provide to mitigate any of these impacts. But unfortunately, freak accidents still happen. I think the one lady mentioned a drift event, so a nearby farm was spraying, and just due to drift, I think they lost almost 200 hives. And
Wow.
so, yeah, again, such complex issues, but definitely overlap. And yes, we are chatting to the bug people, but not actively working with them at this stage. But I'm sure that will come in time, because understanding the insect diversity on the farms will be a key aspect in terms of understanding the bird diversity as well when we get to our field study stage.
Yeah, so much work to be done.
Yes. Yeah, I need to clone myself.
Yes. So we still have quite a few questions, but we are now 8:15, and I can see
Goodness, sorry.
no, it's fine. It's been interesting. I see the participant numbers are dropping off slightly, so maybe we'll just do a couple more questions and then we'll leave it there. And if you wouldn't mind, I can send you the questions afterwards and you can get back to people if you have the time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem. Or yeah, my email should still be on the screen, I think, if it's still
Yes,
visible. So they're also welcome to contact me directly.
great, thanks. Um, let's see the last two questions. Okay, this is going to be another tongue twister for me. From John Hart, saying thanks for an interesting presentation. Chlorpyrifos, as I
Mhm.
expected, is on the list. Is there any evidence of toxicity of human pharma metabolites affecting fauna and flora, especially with the increase in new anti-neoplastics / cane treatment agents? I don't know if that makes sense to you. I don't quite understand what
No,
what is
no,
getting
sorry. I got lost after you said the human part.
human pharma metabolites affecting plants and animals, especially with an increase in the use of new anti-neoplastics and cane treatment agents.
Human farmer. No, sorry. I don't know if that's a typo or if that's what you mean. Sorry. No, I'm not familiar with that at all.
Sorry,
No.
John, maybe you can
Maybe
email
send it to me
Lorinda.
in email. Yeah, sorry. After all the words, I start losing what's actually being asked. Sorry.
I saw a comment briefly in the chat saying that we should teach people Latin to better understand all of these chemical
Yeah.
names.
Well, I mean, it's honestly was like learning a new language. And the
Mm,
safety data sheets, for example, are when you start reading the first two paragraphs, I don't know how the average person, I have a PhD and I don't understand half of it. So, yeah, as much as they're important and have to be there, and I just don't think they're very user friendly at all. So,
mm.
what information is actually being passed on is probably quite limiting, which is a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Needs to be a relook at those package
Mm.
inserts. So then one last question, and kind of linked to another one from, oh, now I've lost it, sorry. It was a question about, or from Penelope saying, why not getting geese to eat pests in vineyards? And then also Eleanor Mary saying, you raised the topic of soil degradation. Are you able to include this area in your research? So it's sort of on the theme of more sustainable practices that don't require all these pesticides. Is that something that you are also kind of working in and would include in your theoretical brochure one day, or is that kind of out of the scope?
Well, at the heart of it, the soil quality is possibly one of the most important things for the farmer, and in terms of the produce. So the more things you have to add to the soil to get your products, the greater your cost, of course, and the labor involved with that, and so on. So soil health really is such a focal point in this movement in more sustainable farming. And so much so that some farmers are even impregnating soil with microbes to break down certain compounds in the soil or to increase fertility in other ways. And so, yeah, the soil thing, that's why we have soil scientists. It's a whole separate science that's, yeah, definitely beyond my capabilities, but definitely something I will need to consider and incorporate in some way, even if it is in partnership with someone with far more knowledge than me on the topic. Yeah, and in terms of the geese, those, I think there's one farm that in South Africa has those Indian runner ducks, and it's part of an experience. You go and they let them out and they go and forage. It's quite common in India, in the rice fields as well. Not so common here, but yes, it just, again, it comes down to the scale of the farm and the cost of it, and now looking after birds, vaccinating birds. Yeah, everything has all its challenges to consider, but definitely an option. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no simple solutions, but it's great that we have someone working to at least sort of uncover some of them. And yeah, so I think we'll leave it there. So apologies to everyone whose questions we didn't get to, but as I said, hopefully Lorinda can answer some of those on email. But yeah, thank you very much, Lorinda, for a great presentation, and well done on all of the work you've achieved so far. We look forward to maybe having you back in another year or so, and you can update us.
Definitely looking forward to it.
Great. So yeah, that's it from us this evening. Just to say, please do join us again in 2 weeks' time, where Jessica Wilmot will be sharing her work on migratory birds and migration. And with that, I will say good night. Thank you very much, Lorinda, and thank you very much to our viewers.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.